All right. Well, welcome back to another Sunday School Teacher Workshop and the first pending Sunday of a new quarter. So just a quick announcement in case, I don't think it's quite been made public yet, but we did not forget about our recent Sunday School Teacher Quarterly Intensive. It just happened to have coincided the same weekend as Memorial Day. So as opposed to trying to have it here the same Sunday as my Memorial Day picnic, which would have no doubt turned into an epic disaster, nobody would have come. We decided not to do that this time around, and so the presentation, as you see here on the screen, is ready to go. It's just pending the time frame to be sent out, and I'm actually breaking up the presentation itself, as goes the recorded session, into 4 parts. It could be 3, depending upon how effective I am at being able to condense it all, and it's going to be sent out in segments to you. So Richard has that, and he will be getting that to you ASAP. But having said that, this upcoming week's first lesson, entitled Jesus Over Nature, coming from Mark chapter 4, is one of those doublets stories where we have Jesus out on the water and a major storm has come to threaten the disciples. Of course, this first one is with him seated or sleeping in the bow of the ship, and his disciples, out of fear for their lives, are waking him up, screaming at him, asking him if he cares that they're about to die. And then, of course, he speaks to the wind and the waves, and everything comes to an immediate standstill, and then he questions their faith. Next one being the time when Jesus sends his disciples out ahead of him. He remains for some time into the evening, prays on the side of the mountain, then joins them as he's walking past them on the water while the wind and waves are raging. So we're looking at that particular moment when Jesus is in the ship with them and asleep. So out of the entire presentation that I have for you, tonight, or this upcoming Sunday's material, is by far the most complex of these, and so I might not get through all of these slides, but I hope to, because I really would like for it to make sense. Having said that, if you see the title on the screen there, Isaiah's New Exodus walked through a Jonah story. So let me just take a second or two to try to help clue you in as to what I mean by this, because I'm going to be explaining some background and context. So Isaiah's New Exodus, if you look at Isaiah chapter 40 through the end of the scroll, 66, while he has already sprinkled some pretty prevalent seeds throughout the first 39 chapters, it really becomes a more predominant theme, almost to the exclusion of everything else from Isaiah 40 through 66, with respect to the idea of Israel's exile in Babylon coming to an end and God's intended restoration of this people, spearheading that with the servant that appears first in chapter 42, 49 through 50 coming after that. And this servant is the one who is going to bring about this new Exodus. Now granted, there's another character called the servant, that's Cyrus, but he just comes and fades very quickly, almost as quickly as he arrives on the scene. He's the one who gets the pleasure of being able to say to Israel to go back to their homeland and, of course, fund not only the expedition, but the rebuilding of city and temple. But he is a moniker, a type, if you will, of the actual true servant who is introduced one chapter later as the one who is really going to be making the Exodus happen in its entirety. But of course, from Isaiah's day to where Jesus and those of his time, contemporary to him, are, there's about 5 centuries that span this very graduated effort at bringing about this Exodus. And the real Exodus does not happen until Messiah appears on the scene, because every promise entangled with the new Exodus has to be inaugurated by the Messiah. It's much in the same as you can say that the initial Exodus out of Egypt, while it began with them walking out of Egypt, did not reach its culmination until 40 years later. They eventually cross over the Jordan. That whole generation has died in the wilderness. A younger generation are now the ones who are going to go and inherit the land. So it sets us up for what we would expect, albeit, of course, with the second and final Exodus, it's far more graduated with the 5 centuries that intervene between those two. So Isaiah's new Exodus, spearheaded by Messiah, walked through a Jonah story. Jonah's story is very quaint, rather simplistic, and so most of us are very familiar with the idea of what happens with respect to the prophet being called, his initial rebellion, what happens out on the sea, and those are the points that I want to bring together with it. We're not going to go through the whole Jonah story, mainly what happens in chapter 1 and 2 with respect to the prophet being out on the sea. So in the black box there at the top, so Mark's gospel quotes almost exclusively from the Isaiah scroll in framing up Jesus' ministry. As I've said here in the first green box, the context of Isaiah 40 through 66, and many of these prophetic promises are depicted as a reenactment of Israel crossing through the Red Sea. So Isaiah's poetic and rather hyperbolic language is not meant to be taken literally in speaking of how creation is going to be transformed, or that God is going to be parting any particular body of water for these people to be able to cross through and get back to the land. He is hearkening back to that original Exodus expedition for the sake of showing them that his track record is one of faithfulness and consistency. While they are questioning his character in Isaiah 40, making the claim he's forgotten about them, he continues to hearken back to the Exodus to say there is absolutely no basis for that claim. All evidence points to the idea that God has always had them in mind. In spite of their faithlessness, he has still proven himself faithful, and there would be no reason to think otherwise. So Isaiah 43, coming right in the midst of the chapters I've cited for you here, this is what the Lord says, citing the fact he is the one who makes a way in the sea, a path through the raging water, and then he qualifies the reason why he uses that statement to say, look, I'm about to do something new. Even now it's coming. Don't you see it? Indeed, I will make a way in the wilderness, rivers in the desert. Again, that's not meant to be taken literally as if to say God is going to do that. He is speaking about the idea that when they return from exile in Babylon back to their homeland, it's going to be seen as a new exodus. God is going to be ushering every step of that for them, such that there's no way they can give credit or glory to anyone else other than God and see it as a divine act of his hand. Now to Isaiah 51, the question being asked of the Lord, wasn't it you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the seabed into a road for the redeemed to pass over it? We clearly make the connection. This is to the first wilderness journey of Israel out of Egypt. And then Isaiah qualifies the reason for asking the question by saying, and the ransomed of the Lord will return and come to Zion with singing, crowned with unending joy. So we can already begin to see the interplay between the past Exodus and the future Exodus and what it's pointing us to. So now, going to the green box on the right side of the screen, something we need to understand here. In the Isaiah scroll, the nations are seen in this kind of paradoxical, sort of contradictory positioning with the way that Isaiah paints them in one particular light and then in another light elsewhere. Such as Isaiah 17. He says, the roar of many peoples. They roar like the roaring of the seas. The raging of the nations. They rage like the rushing of water. The nations rage like the rumble of a huge torrent, but God rebukes them. So you go back to the creation story, and you have the primordial waters that are covering the dry land underneath that God speaks to. He orders that chaos. He brings dry land out from underneath it, and then the rest of creation can flourish as he continues to work to create and order. But in many sequences of the story beyond that, Noah's flood and whatnot, we see where God is seemingly always keeping back the chaotic waters that at any moment could serve as a complete source of obliteration for all of creation. Again, the Noah story. And God is working to keep them at bay, but they obey him. They become a symbol of the nations that surround tiny little Israel, because in the little crossroads of the world they exist in, they are surrounded by formidable foes that at any moment could easily be used by God, and are through the story of the judges and so forth, or other kingdoms that eventually turn into empires, such as the days of Assyria and beyond, where God uses them as a mighty hammer to exact judgment and justice on nations who rebel against him and his own people, Israel, and the kingdom of Judah. So God orders the chaotic nations the same way he orders the chaotic waters of the creation stories. But then you go to Isaiah 19, and in Isaiah's day, the more formidable foe was the Assyrian Empire, who was threatening everyone and could easily trounce any nation in their path. Israel was no exception to that. And while they are the future formidable foe, Egypt has been their formidable foe in the past, right, during the time of the exile. But notice this particular part of the story where in Isaiah 19, Isaiah says, as the Lord is declaring, on that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and Assyria will go to Egypt, Egypt to Assyria, and Egypt will worship with Assyria. On that day, Israel will form a triple alliance with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing within the land, and the Lord of armies will bless them, saying, Egypt my people, Assyria my handiwork, and Israel my inheritance are blessed. So these three nations now will all be reconciled together and be considered as one people group having distinction while unified together. Despite their ethnic and cultural differences, they are a united people who are considered blessed by the Lord and His carved out handiwork. Whereas Israel was in the past, now the nations, symbolized through Assyria and Egypt, will be together with Israel, worshiping the one true God. Now, I get what you're saying. You're probably already scratching your head saying, what does this have to do with Jesus being asleep in the boat on the sea? Well, that would lead us to our next slide, but first I want to read to you Isaiah 51:15, reminding us that the Lord your God is the one who stirs up the sea, which in this case, it's not just meant to be seen as the sea that people will cross through in the ancient Exodus story, but even the nations. God treating them like the sea, He will part nations out of the way for all of His people. And in Isaiah's scroll, at this stage in the game, His people is not just ethnic Israel. His people are the ethnic Israelites who follow the servant Messiah, and the nations, those who have come out from the darkness of the nations to join in with Israel as part of Israel, God's new covenant family. So this is the reason why I bring this up. Looking at the map on the screen, what we're about to see situationally in the story that leads us into the context of Mark 4 is that Jesus is here with His disciples in Capernaum. And they are about to cross over the sea and come down to the region here of the Gergesenes. And this part of the world right here is known as the Decapolis, which is primarily, almost exclusively, of Gentile settlement. Now, there are a few sparse Jewish settlements, and they live in something of an uneasy tension with each other. Having said that, though, there is a specific and profound reason why Jesus is about to go with His disciples across the sea. So while we could easily summarize this story as a moment where Mark is making mention, as Matthew and Luke will too, of this moment where Jesus' own disciples, the handpicked 12 who are now His apostles, are going to learn a valuable lesson, that Jesus is more than just a human being, and certainly more than just a militaristic figure who is going to help them conquer Rome and give them their kingdom back. That He is indeed God incarnated in human flesh. But I would say that's a lesson that a 10-year-old can learn. Nothing against that. And not to say that there aren't graduated levels of people who in our classes might be more at that level with respect to where they understand the Bible or what they understand of the Bible. But as an adult, there's no reason to not challenge them to understand there is a complexity of overlays going on in this story that does way more than just vaunt Jesus as being God incarnated in human flesh. So starting on the left side of the screen with the purple and orange boxes, we understand geographically Capernaum is where they are. We understand also that when Jesus speaks, they are going across the sea. That's exactly what He has told them. They are going to be crossing over to the other side. When we get to the other side of Mark 4, at the beginning of Mark 5, we understand that's where they're going to be in the area of the Gerasenes, going from Jewish area to Gentile area. Now, we can already start to see this begins to frame up the story of Jonah for us, right? Jonah is an Israelite prophet. He lives in the northern kingdom of Israel. He is going to be sent to Nineveh all the way across the Mesopotamian river valley to the east side of the Tigris River, where Nineveh is the capital of the Assyrian Empire. So he's got quite a journey ahead of him. Having said that, though, he's going from an area where his own people have lived, and that's where their nation has been for centuries, to an area where the scariest of all Gentile kingdoms are. It's not quite that profound with respect to what Jesus is doing, but you can see the symbolism behind what His journey is about to undertake. And they are going to encounter a great windstorm that's going to be breaking over the boat, such that the disciples and the boat themselves, the boat itself is being swamped, and of course they are going to be deathly afraid for their very lives. All right, now to the first set of blue boxes at the top of the screen. So, going back a little bit to Mark chapter 2, we understand that Jesus is by the sea. This is the Sea of Galilee, and He's on the western edge, close to Capernaum. He happens to saunter up to the little tax booth there, where he will find Matthew. He calls Matthew, says, "Follow me," and that's exactly what Matthew does. What's the next thing that happens in the Matthew story? Matthew goes and rounds up a pool of his own friends, the people who alone will socialize with him, for nobody else will. These publicans, these sinners and so forth, these tax collectors, and he invites them to a dinner, and Jesus and His disciples. We have the Pharisees who come and they challenge Jesus and His disciples as to what they're doing, their frame of mind here, and all of that to simply say that with this, Jesus makes it clear He is not the physician who come to heal those who are already okay. Instead, he is the one who has come to call the sinners to repentance, which obviously is a jab pointed at them. But here's the point. Here's the point. This brings us back to the Isaiah scroll. Let's go back to one of the more profound servant songs of Isaiah 49. This is what the Lord says to his servant, who is Messiah. And now says the Lord, who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, so that Israel might be gathered to him. So one of the primary roles of the servant is he is going to reconcile the broken houses of Israel and Judah together and unto the Lord. So who or what is Matthew? Matthew is a Jew, right? Would you say Matthew is in or out as far as Jewish society at large goes? Well, he's a tax collector. He's a sympathizer for the Romans. He's lining his own pockets with the extra money he exacts from his own people. They hate him. They would wish him dead, as they would every tax collector. They consider him base like they would all of the other Romans. So having said that, he is spiritually far from God, and he is certainly ethnically far from his people. This guy is on the fringe. So he is one of those primary targets that Jesus would be coming to reconcile, to the chagrin and the scandalous astonishment of every other Jew who considers themselves righteous and pious in Jesus' day, because they think Matthew is the kind of person who is too far gone and beyond the help of anyone, and certainly no one like Messiah would ever come and approach them, for not even the rabbis will go and talk to someone like Matthew. But as the servant, as Messiah, this is exactly what his job is. We go a little further, Matthew 3. So Jesus has been accused of being in league with Satan and drawing power from Satan and using sorcery as a means of actually casting demons out of people. And Jesus calls this stupidity out for what it is. And he makes it simple that unless a person enters into a strong man's house and first binds him, he cannot plunder his possessions and make them his own. So that's what he's announcing. That's what he's come to do, is to pounce on the strong man. Now we cross over the story of Matthew or Mark 4 and the sailing on the sea to get to Mark 5. I keep wanting to say Matthew. I'm sorry if I do that. I don't mean to confuse. To Mark 5, where now Jesus and the disciples have crossed the sea. They get to the region of the Gerasenes, and who do they encounter? But this crazy wild man who sleeps in the tombs, cuts himself day and night, screaming wildly, scares everyone, and apparently is endowed with superhuman strength such that he can just snap iron fetters like they're nothing. Notice what Isaiah also says in Isaiah 49, the very next verse. It's not enough for you to be my servant, raising up the tribes of Jacob. I will also make you a light for the nations, so that you may bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. Point being, Messiah's mission is not only to restore Israel, but also reconcile the nations unto God. So here we have, bracketing this moment where Jesus and the disciples are caught vulnerably out on the sea in the midst of a raging storm. Jesus has called Matthew, and he has made him one of his closest followers by bringing him in as a disciple. And not only that, but showing this to all the religious community around him by eating bread with Matthew. To eat at the dinner table with Matthew is to show the most intimate form of acceptance, socially speaking. So having said that, it makes perfect sense then that as we move beyond this story and the crossing of the sea, that the next expected movement would be something like that to the Gentiles. And Jesus seems to pick the gravest target he can find, a guy who has thousands of demons potentially, given the name of the creature in him, or creatures, Legion, teeming through this guy, and he casts those demons out and then creates a missionary amongst the Gentiles in the Gerasene area, as this guy wants to follow Jesus, and he simply says no and turns him back to these people to tell his story of what God has done. So all of this is still something of a Jonah story. It's the idea of branching out to the Gentiles and seeking to reconcile them unto God, preaching the concept of repentance and watching them as they either submit to God and his demands or instead continue in their darkness and rebel. So now to the third level, and the third level of blue boxes. So now we get into the beginning of Mark 4. Again, teaching by the sea, a very large crowd gathered around him. He got into the boat, sat down, he taught them many things, beginning to dispel for them what the kingdom's going to be like as he begins his ministry in parable speaking. A little further down in Mark 4, we get to the heart of where we are. Jesus is given the example of why he does this. He says that they may indeed look and yet not perceive. He said to them, don't you understand the parable? How then will you not understand all the parables if you can't grasp this one? Point being, we go back to Isaiah 51, and this is what was said for the servant. Pay attention to me, my people. Listen to me, my nation, for instruction will come from me, and justice, and my justice for a light to the nations, and I will bring it about quickly. Again, broadcasting what the servant is supposed to do. So the servant is helping make clear exactly what Torah means for the people. That's part of speaking in parables. That's also part of his delivery of the Sermon on the Mount, is to make clear that all of these extra baggages that's been attached to it from people such as scribes, Pharisees, for generations now, that have been tacked on to the law and teachings of Moses, is not meant to be part of God's instruction to the nation, nor his destiny for these people. Instead, it goes back to the basic stories of what exactly Messiah was supposed to do in being a reconciliatory and mediatory figure for the people. Now down to these red boxes. I'm going to invert it here. We're going to read from Isaiah first before we get to the blue box. So this is what the Lord says, who makes a way in the sea, a path through raging water. We just read that. And Isaiah 51:10. Wasn't it you who dried up the sea? So calling out the fact God is the one who manipulates water. He manipulates the nations for the sake of his purposes. We get right to this moment where Jesus is on the sea with them. They wake him up in dire straits. They're terrified. They don't know what to do, and they're afraid they're going to die. So Jesus immediately reacts by speaking to the wind and waves. It ceases. He looks to them and he asks, why are you afraid? Where is your faith? And so they're terrified, and they ask one another, who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him? All that to simply say, in this moment, what we're looking at here from the Isaiah scroll, part of the reason why I've been reading so much of it to you is to show you that from the Isaiah scroll, we have God constantly pointing back. It's either him or his prophet speaking to God and pointing back to the moment of the Exodus and speaking about how God from creation and through the story of Noah and the crossing of the Red Sea has continued to show these moments where God is pulling his people from exile and bringing them through Exodus and into new creation. This is exactly what's happening in this story here. The only one who in the entire biblical record has been able to control the wind and the waves or part them, manipulate them for the sake of the safety of his people. And what that means on the other side of when they go through this tumult of whatever the water's doing. With Noah, it's destruction of the world, but new creation on the other end, exile to Exodus. With Israel and Egypt, it's severing their connection with Egypt to walk through into new creation as a new covenant family that's going to be the part of a new humanity that's going to reconcile all the nations unto God. It's truly a new beginning for all of humanity. This is a very small kind of microscopic way of looking at it, but that's kind of what's going on here in this story. Jesus has just called 12 disciples and made them his apostles. There's a reason why it's 12 and not 6 or 15 or 9 or 20. 12, of course, would hint to the idea that this is indeed a new or renewed Israel. With that in mind, the idea would be that Jesus is taking this renewed Israel across a sea, and he's making a trek into Gentile territory to seek out a man who is, again, completely overrun with demons for the sake of giving this man not only his sanity and dignity back, but showing that a light has dawned, that a new humanity is arising from the ashes of the old. And it's starting with Israel, as was prophesied by Isaiah, and it's going to eke out to the nations. And Jesus is planting a seed there in the Gerasene region because years will go by and his disciples, apostles, will go back through that area and continue on in the evangelistic work of this guy once possessed by demons to help bring others to Christ. All right, so now finishing off this connection with the Jonah story, I'm just going to jump into the purple boxes because our time's running out. So notice here, I've got about half a dozen parallels for you, starting with the Mark story in chapter 4 and looking to the Jonah story on the right. So first purple box, Jesus, the Lord, as we understand from this story, God incarnated in human flesh, said, let's go over to the other side of the sea. The very same God who spoke to Jonah, the prophet he pulls out from the northern kingdom of Israel and tells him not to cross necessarily sea, but land and a few bodies of water, the rivers, to get to the capital of the Assyrian kingdom, Nineveh, and to go and preach to them. Next, we would see back in Mark 4. So they left the crowd, and they took him along since he was in the boat. So Jonah gets in a boat himself. Now, we have two different reasons and rationales here. Jesus intends to get in the boat. Jonah was simply getting in the boat because of his rebellion against the Lord. So there's a slight little bit of a difference there, but the story requires these details to get to where they're going. Third purple box, a windstorm arises. In both stories, again, it's because of Jonah's rebellion and the fact that God is not going to let him run away, but he is turning him back so that Jonah will accomplish his will. Jesus is intentionally going out there, but the question remains, why in the world does Jesus fall asleep? One could easily argue he's exhausted. That's probably true. But at the same time, one would also have to question, is Jesus the one who is ultimately responsible for bringing the storm out on the sea to test his disciples as he does? Much in the same way that he intentionally brought the storm on the sea to test Jonah. All right, so we know that Jesus and Jonah are both completely asleep. Jesus in a small, tiny, rickety boat compared to the one that's big enough for multiple levels that Jonah is in, but nonetheless, they are sleeping soundly through a terrible, raging storm that everybody else who's awake are afraid enough and skirmishing about to the point where they're doing everything they can to try to desperately save their lives. The occupants of the boats are both terrified in the story, whether it's the disciples or the sailors in Jonah's story. Sixth on the left side. So they wake Jesus up. Teacher, don't you care we're going to die? Sailors come and they rouse Jonah. Hey, buddy, get busy praying to your God because we're doing everything we can here and we're still, after throwing the cargo over and praying, chanting to our gods, it's doing nothing. You're obviously doing nothing. So get up, do something, call out to your God. Whereas Jesus is the one who calms the sea, God is the one who calms the sea in the Jonah story as well. Now here's the rub in all of this. And the reason why I think Mark is drawing on this, not to say, and I hope you don't take this from any of these moments when I try to draw the parallel out between these stories, as if to say Mark is making up a story where Jesus was asleep in a ship, where he's sailing across the sea with his disciples, and he's making it look like, dressing it up to look like a Jonah story because he has nothing else to say about Jesus or just needed one more miraculous story to throw in there. That's certainly not the case. There may have been other details surrounding that story, but what we do know is that it is intentionally framed up to look like the Jonah story, in many ways parallel it, but also to take it and turn it on its head. Jonah is part of the prophet tradition, from Moses all the way down through Jesus, and Jesus stands as the epitome and the culmination of that line of prophets from Moses all the way down. That's important for us to recognize because of the fact much of what Jesus will say and will do will draw upon the tradition of those prophets. You think about it. At certain points, he's like an Elijah who is praying up to God when he is standing there on Mount Carmel saying, God, let all these people know that I am your servant and you hear me. What is Jesus doing when he's standing outside the tomb of Lazarus? When he's about to raise him from the dead? Does he need to pray? No. He could have simply rolled the stone away himself without asking anybody to do it for him. But he lifts his hands, he raises his voice to heaven, and he prays, and he says, God, I know you always hear me, but I want these people to know that you hear me. Or like a Jeremiah who stands in the temple and he says, you are turning the house of the Lord into a den of thieves. Or like an Isaiah who decries that indeed the temple is being assaulted by their horrible blasphemous crimes, turning a house of prayer for the nations into a detestable sanctuary of sin and destitution. And Jesus combines both of those statements when he is cleansing the temple in his Passion Week. What am I saying here? Jesus draws on multiple prophetic traditions and multiple moments of seeing Jesus through the lens of these prophets to say he is the top of that ladder or mountain. So if that's the case, then the Jonah tradition also feeds into the Jesus story. Jonah's running from God. Jesus, as God, is going exactly where he intends to go. Storms rise, and it's not for the testing of the sailors, but Jonah so much. But here we have the disciples who hear clearly the words of the Lord who says, we're going to go to the other side. And they don't trust in that. And when the storm comes, they're afraid, thinking they're going to die, rather than simply knowing that if he said we're going to the other side, guess where we're going? And when they get there, the last thing they ever could have thought was going to happen is they're going to face down this guy who, again, was a scary terror to everybody around for the sake of not only making this man whole, but showing clearly Jesus' mission is not just for the lost sheep of Israel. It's for all humanity. And he drops those seeds at several points to show very clearly this is exactly what Jesus intends. So I'll just sum it all up by saying Jesus is taking the restored Israel to accomplish their mandate to go to the nations. if you've heard nothing else I've said, or still scratching your head to try to put it all together, this is what I intend from this, is to show you that Jesus is taking the renewed Israel, symbolized in the 12 disciples, to accomplish their mission, which is exactly what Isaiah said was going to happen. That the faithless Israel who rebelled against God, that caused their destruction, demise, and exile in Babylon to start with, is going to be reformed through that 70-year captivity. And God is going to make them into a nation who is going to serve as His primary witness to the nations of what His glory and grace is all about. Jonah is the Israel who failed to fulfill their mandate to go to the nations, and Jesus is correcting that. All right. Well, any questions from anybody here in the audience? All right. Well, I do appreciate your time. Thanks for listening.